Hello and welcome back. In this chapter, we're going to be covering hope, which is a very important aspect of positive psychology. So let us begin. All right, part of hope is optimism. So, one of the things that you can do is take the life orientation test that is provided in the ebook. You can find it on page 184, and this is a short form that assesses optimism using 10 items. And you'll notice that it's called the life orientation test. I think the designers of the study of the scale were kind of hoping to somewhat mask their intent with these questions, but I'm going ahead and disclosing to you that this is an optimism scale. You use a Likert type scale again, and notice that the coding is a little bit different on this one. So when you go to compute your score, notice that the strongly disagree, you give yourself a 0 rather than the typical 1 that we've been doing throughout the quarter. And so the max score is a 4 rather than the 5 that we've normally been seeing. You do still have a neutral on this one, so you can be on the fence, but I'll again disclose to you as a test taker, if you're really looking for any kind of insights, if you're really wanting to know which way you lean, when in doubt, try, if you're wanting to say neutral, it's to your advantage to go ahead and either go with the 1 disagree or the 3 agree rather than the neutral. You'll get a more well-rounded picture of your own optimism. It's already hard enough to take these scales and be honest and, end up with a score that means something. So it's already hard enough. So I feel like that's why it's important as a person who's doing it to maybe gain some insights about yourself to go ahead and take the scale that way. It tells you how to score the scale, and it does have some reversed scored items, so don't miss that part. And then there's also, I wanted to point out to you that there are 4 items that are just really here for filler. I won't name them. I'll scroll back up. So because sometimes we want, like I said, I think these scale designers wanted to kind of mask the intent of the scale. So some things are included in here that have nothing to do with optimism. So anyway, that is your scale for this time. So if you want to take that, this is the short form. There is a longer form, but I've had difficulty finding it. So I don't know if they're just selling it now, and that's why I'm having difficulty finding the full form. But anyway, so you can take the short form, 10 items. All right, find out how much optimism you actually have. So now that hopefully you've taken the scale, done a little insight on yourself, what is optimism? What do we mean by that term? Again, one of those constructs that you know full well what it means, right? You know what it is, but it's a construct. So honestly, there are a lot of different ways we could define the concept. So when we talk about it in the context of this class, what we're generally talking about is a tendency to expect the best possible outcome. Whoops. So the tendency to expect the best possible outcome. And then I've got more that I want to say, but I wanted to show you this little video really quickly. So let me get that queued up for us real quick. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and just run this for us rather than putting it into any kind of playlist because it's only available on web pages now. It's not a YouTube video. So let's go ahead and watch this spot.
We asked people all over the country, what's something significant that's happened to you in the last 5 years?
Bought a house.
My mom passed away.
First really serious relationship.
I graduated college.
Then we asked them what might happen in the next 5 years. The good things were put on yellow magnets, and the bad ones on blue. The results showed us something interesting. It turns out the past was a pretty even mix of good and bad, yet the future was almost all good things. Now that you've seen the results of this experiment, what does it mean to you?
We all want to think about positive stuff.
Realistically, there will be down times.
Definitely prepare myself for anything that could happen in life, not just the good things.
It's great to think optimistically, but let's plan for whatever the future might bring.
So I'm not trying to advertise. I think that's Prudential. I'm not trying to advertise for them, but it's a really good ad for depicting the concept that we're talking about here. Whoops, sorry. Hopefully you couldn't hear that because I had turned off the dashboard sound. So optimism is expecting good outcomes, right? And so when we're looking towards the future, um, as they did in this bit, they were people were tending to overestimate the likelihood of good things happening in their future, right? So the a tendency to expect the best possible outcome or to dwell on the most hopeful aspects of a situation. So when in a situation, a person who displays optimism will tend to display hope. They'll display that they're expecting something good to happen or some way out of maybe a negative experience. Like, for example, this person buried halfway, up to his waist or in like the Sahara Desert or something, but he's hopeful. Someone will come. Someone's going to come and get me. Um, that's optimism displayed in the hope that this bad situation is not the end, that something will happen to avert the possible bad outcome, right? Um, so that is like the premise is that that would be a person's tendency in general, not just in a specific situation, but in general, to have that sort of optimistic outlook that good things will probably happen in the long run, and that if something negative happens, that there is still hope in that circumstance. So sorry about this bad animation there. There we go. So when we talk about optimism, the sort of polar opposite of it would be despair, where you sort of just give up, like there's no hope when you're in despair. Here we have a cartoon where the caption says, "We do pretty well when you stop to think that people are basically good." So the devil is saying, for a situation where most people are basically good, we sure do have a lot of customers here in hell, right? So we have this continuum, this idea that, yeah, maybe people are basically good, but we have to guard a little bit, right? But we don't want to go into despair where we give up and we say it's hopeless. All people are terrible. All situations are bad. It's never going to get better. That's despair. So some people criticize positive psychology for overemphasizing the benefits of optimism by saying, yeah, we need hope. We don't want people dwelling in despair. That's true. So they say, okay, yes, you are encouraged. Positive psychology is encouraging the hope that we need. That's true. But not enough realism about evil. This basic premise that all people are good, for example, that's a positive psychology tenet, that most people are basically good, but it kind of minimizes or ignores the fact that there are people who do very bad things, that maybe even good people sometimes do bad things, stuff like that. So critics of positive psychology say that positive psychology doesn't take enough of the bad side into consideration and maybe even see the value in the bad side. What I think they're arguing against is, what I think the critics are arguing against is the value of naive optimism. They're saying we don't want to be naive optimists. This is where it's bad, is that naive optimism. In this kind of optimism, you're denying threats, and you're having hope in situations where maybe action would help you, but instead you're saying it'll all work out, right? I don't need to do anything because it's all going to work out anyway. That's, to me, honestly, naive optimism is almost a type of despair because, again, it doesn't foster agency. Naive optimism says luck or fate or God's plan is going to ultimately come to fruition anyway, so there's no need for me to take protective steps for myself. One of the examples that they give of naive optimists would be a person who maybe they've discovered a bump on their skin, and instead of getting it checked out by a doctor, they say, "Oh, I'm sure it's fine. I'm sure it's nothing," and they deny the possible risk that could come from having a bump on your skin. The bump on your skin could be completely benign. That's true, and a lot of times things that are in our skin are completely benign, but it wouldn't hurt to get it checked out now, would it? You don't want to be a naive optimist who says it'll all work out, I don't need to take any action. That's, I think, where a lot of the critics are kind of getting positive psychology wrong, because one of the things hopefully you've been picking up across the chapters is that positive psychology is really big on agency, on autonomy, right? Self-regulation, these kinds of things. And so it's positive psychology is not encouraging people to be naive optimists, where they just assume it's going to work out whether they do anything themselves, to make sure it works out. Positive psychology much more emphasizes realistic optimism. Encourage enough realism to fuel concern. Okay, sometimes a bump can be bad, right? But enough optimism to provide hope. Well, it's still a small bump, so even if it is something bad, more than likely they'll be able to fix it, right? That's optimism, right? So go get it checked out. It's probably going to be dismissed as benign, but if it's not, you went when it was early and they'll be able to fix it, right? Like, that's realistic optimism. You don't want to be a naive optimism where you just say, it's all going to work out. I don't have to do anything. You see the agency in realistic optimism? You see that autonomy that's present in that? We certainly do not want people in dark despair where they say there is no hope, right? And that's another way to be kind of helpless. So naive optimism is a little helpless. Dark despair is really helpless. It doesn't matter what I do anyway. Nothing ever works out. That's the person in dark despair. Doesn't matter what I do anyway. Everything always works out. That's naive optimism. So they're both on that continuum of the polar ends where what I do doesn't matter. Where we want people to be, and what positive psychology means by optimism is realistic optimism, where people feel a sense of agency. So what does realistic, so I'm not going to say realistic on every slide. I'm just going to, that's the last time I'm going to say it. And whenever I say optimism, I hope you'll remember that's what we're talking about. What are the benefits? People who display optimism tend to enjoy better health. And it comes from, for one thing, their immune system tends to function better. They tend to avoid colds. Even there are people who will volunteer for studies where a Q-tip containing the cold virus will be swabbed around in their nose, and they know that. They've consented to it. It turns out that people who score higher on an optimism scale are less likely to contract a cold in that situation than people who score lower on an optimism scale. So optimism must help our immune system because it helps us to avoid even smaller things like colds. People who score higher on optimism scales, like the life orientation test, tend to live longer than people who score lower on it. So it gives the impression that optimism has the benefit of somehow ensuring that a person lives a longer life. People who are higher in optimism tend to have better relationships. When there are disagreements, people who are higher in optimism tend to have more constructive disagreements. They don't devolve into calling names or pointing out the other person's worst characteristics or these kinds of things. Instead, when they have a disagreement, they focus on the topic, all the things that Gottman says that a person should do if they're in a relationship and they're having a disagreement. When there is a disagreement, an optimistic person tends to be more satisfied with the resolution that they come to with their partner. Whether it's a friend or a parent or a romantic relationship, they tend to be more satisfied with how it's been worked out than a person who's lower in optimism. And a person who scores higher in optimism tends to report that even though they just had a disagreement with their relationship partner, they still will report feeling more supported in their relationship than a person who's lower in optimism. So it's not just about sort of being hopeful in general or something. It's really about sort of how they are internalizing what's happening in situations. And in this case, situations involving another person who also has agency and the ability to make choices and do things. A person who is optimistic tends to see their relationship partner through a more positive lens. They tend to see better characteristics. All right, I'm going to stop here because the health benefits of optimism go on for a second. So I'm going to stop here and we'll come back in the next section and we'll talk about the health benefits of optimism.